They say that before time learned to speak in human tongues, the earth whispered in ice. It was the age when the breath of winter ruled every dawn, and the heartbeat of the world was slow, steady as the steps of the giants that roamed its frozen plains. The mammoths, wrapped in endless wool, moved like living mountains beneath a silver sun. And following them, in quiet shadows and distant footprints, came the first great hunters of the Americas, the Clovis people. They were not many, yet they carried in their eyes the fire of discovery, and in their hands the sharp promise of stone. Each fluted spear they carved was a prayer, a memory, and a weapon all at once. With every strike against the rock, sparks of purpose danced into the cold air. They believed that the spirit of the mammoth, once taken, would rise again through the smoke of their fires, reborn in the next hunt, the next life, the next dawn. The land they called home was a wild cathedral of silence. The winds carried no voices, only the distant thunder of hooves across the plains. At night, the sky burned with stars so bright that even the dead might find their way home. Around the campfires, the Clovis told stories of creation, of courage, of beasts that remembered names. They spoke of a time when man and animal were brothers, separated only by the hunger of survival. In the stillness of the valleys, children learned to shape stone before they learned to speak. The old ones taught them to listen, to the cry of the eagle, the cracking of the ice, the rhythm of distant herds. Every sound was a message, every shadow a sign. To live was to understand the language of the world before it forgot how to sing. The hunters followed the mammoths not only for food, but for meaning. To take down such a creature was to challenge death itself. They learned to strike together, to breathe as one, to move like the wind, silent, unseen, inevitable. When the spear finally found its mark, when the giant fell, they did not cheer. They bowed their heads, for they knew that to kill a god was to inherit its burden. As the snow melted and the seasons changed, the world began to whisper differently. The ice receded, rivers widened, and the air felt warmer than memory. The Clovis watched and wondered. Some said it was a blessing, that the world was softening. Others feared it was a sign that balance had been broken. For every patch of green that grew where frost once ruled, something ancient seemed to fade away. Their shamans, cloaked in the hides of beasts, spoke of visions, of fire in the sky, and a silence beneath the earth. The world dreams, they said, and dreams can end. Around the fire, their voices trembled as if the smoke carried secrets too heavy for air. The hunters listened, their eyes reflecting the flames, and somewhere in their chests, the first feeling of loss began to grow. But still, they hunted. Still, they moved with the rhythm of the land. For what else could they do? To stop was to vanish. And the Clovis did not vanish. They endured. For now. The herds moved northward, beyond the melting plains. The Clovis followed, their footprints pressed deep into mud that once was ice. They crossed valleys where mammoths had fallen, and rivers that smelled of iron and ash. They sang to the spirits of the hunt, asking forgiveness for each life taken. In their songs, there was sorrow, but also pride. One night, beneath a sky alive with shifting lights, a young hunter stood apart from his clan. He looked upon the aurora, those curtains of color that rippled across the heavens like fire trapped in glass. And in that glow, he thought he saw shapes, giants walking, fires burning, a world being reborn. He whispered to the sky, not in words, but in breath. And the wind answered with a sound that felt older than language. He did not know that the world was already changing beneath him. He did not know that his people were living in the briefest of eternity, the golden heartbeat before the silence. For now, the fire still burned, the spears still flew, and the echoes of the Mammoth Age still rolled across the frozen earth, carrying the memory of a people who had learned to dance with extinction without knowing its name. They were called the people of the fluted spears, not by themselves, but by those who would one day uncover their bones and wonder who they had been. To the Clovis, the spear was more than a tool. It was memory made stone. Every flute carved into its base was the echo of a breath, a mark of belonging, a silent name whispered into time. Their world stretched wide and endless, from the shadowed canyons of the west to the endless grasslands that brushed the edge of the ice. Each clan wandered like constellations in motion, connected by stories rather than borders. They followed the herds, read the tracks, and spoke to the earth through footprints. Theirs was a knowledge not written in words, but in movement, in pattern, in survival. The days were long, and every sunrise came with a promise: hunt, live, remember. The Clovis knew no cities, no kings, no monuments. Their history was the wind that carried the scent of game, the ash of their fires, and the songs of the hunt. They shaped the land with their steps. They shaped time with their stories. Each spear they crafted began as a conversation between hunter and stone. The maker would sit in silence, feeling the rhythm of the rock, listening to the music hidden in its edges. A strike too hard, and it would shatter. Too soft, and it would not cut. But when the rhythm was right, the stone yielded, revealing its hidden truth. A weapon both graceful and deadly, as precise as thought itself. Around the fire, elders spoke of the first spear, the tool that separated man from shadow. It was said that when the first hunter raised it, the stars themselves leaned closer to see. The spear remembers, they said, and it never forgets the hand that shaped it. In their hearts, the Clovis believed that every tool carried a soul, that to make one was to breathe a small piece of yourself into eternity. But eternity was beginning to tremble. The hunters noticed that the herds moved differently. Once, the mammoths had crossed in great waves, shaking the earth as they passed. Now, their numbers thinned. The air grew heavy, unpredictable. Storms came at strange times, and rivers that once sang turned silent under sudden drought. Some thought the gods were angry. Others believed the world was shedding its old skin. The Clovis adapted. They followed smaller prey, deer, bison, ancient horses, but their hearts ached for the giants that once gave meaning to their hunts. For to hunt a mammoth was to face eternity. To hunt a deer was to survive. And survival, they learned, was a quieter kind of glory. Still, the spirit of the people endured. They built camps beside rivers lined with bone, their fires flickering against the walls of caves where stories were painted in ochre and blood. The images told of hunts, of births, of storms, of dreams. They did not write words, they painted time itself. In those paintings, we see what they saw, the world alive and trembling with meaning. Every handprint was a promise. I was here. I lived. I watched the stars fall and still found warmth in the dark. The Clovis lived not in fear of the world, but in rhythm with it. When the sky turned gray, they read its tone. When the earth cracked, they listened to its pain. They understood that the land was not theirs to rule, but theirs to remember. And yet, even as they adapted, a strange tension grew among them. The old shamans whispered that the earth's breath had changed. Nights grew longer, and the northern lights burned brighter than ever before. as if the heavens themselves were trying to speak. Some hunters dreamed of falling stars and rivers of fire. Others awoke in the night, certain they had heard the mammoths crying from beneath the ground. The clans began to drift apart. Some sought warmer lands to the south, chasing stories of green valleys and rivers that never froze. Others stayed behind, unwilling to abandon the graves of their ancestors. And though none could name it, they all felt it, the thinning of something unseen. A thread that once tied them to the heartbeat of the earth was fraying. One winter night, a shaman stood before the clan's fire and cast a handful of ash into the wind. "The world remembers every step," he said, "but it also forgets." The hunters listened in silence. They did not yet understand what he meant. But far above them, beyond the reach of their fires, something was already moving. A light hidden behind the veil of the stars, waiting for the right moment to fall. The people of the fluted spears slept beneath the shimmering sky, their dreams heavy with omens they could not name. Tomorrow, the sun would rise again, but it would not rise the same. The first signs came, not from the earth, but from the heavens. At first, they were whispers of light, thin streaks across the night sky, beautiful, harmless, mesmerizing. The Clovis hunters paused in their journeys to watch them, believing they were the spirits of their ancestors returning to dance among the stars. But beauty, they soon learned, can be the gentlest mask of destruction. The sky began to change. Night after night, the streaks grew brighter, thicker, hungrier. They tore across the heavens in silence, leaving trails of fire that refused to fade. The shamans said the sky was cracking, that the world above was bleeding light. One evening, as the clans gathered by the river's edge, the heavens opened. A flash brighter than 1,000 fires consumed the horizon. The air trembled, the animals screamed. Then came the sound, a roar that seemed to tear through bone, through thought, through time itself. The hunters dropped their spears. The mothers clutched their children. And, for the first time, the people of the fluted spears felt small. Not before the mammoth, nor the storm, but before the sky itself. Then came the fire. It fell not as a single flame, but as a rain of stars. The forests burned. The ice cracked and melted in violent bursts. Rivers boiled and ran black with ash. The air grew thick, unbreathable, filled with dust that blotted out the sun. Day turned to twilight, and twilight turned to endless night. In the chaos, the Clovis tried to understand. Their shamans spoke of angry spirits, of gods who had grown tired of mankind's arrogance. Others believed the sky itself had fallen asleep, and its dreams were setting the world ablaze. Whatever the truth, their world, the one carved by ice and silence, was ending. The mammoths fled first, their cries echoing like thunder across the plains. The great beasts stampeded toward nowhere, guided by ancient fear. But the fire outran them all. Herds that had ruled the earth for thousands of years vanished into the smoke, their bones glowing red beneath the falling ash. And then came the cold. The fires did not birth warmth, they stole it. After the light came the darkness, heavy and absolute. A new kind of winter descended upon the land. The sun, once the pulse of their days, became a dim ghost behind veils of gray. The stars vanished, and the moon itself seemed wounded. the Clovis wandered through a silent wasteland. Snow and ash mixed together, falling endlessly. The rivers froze solid. The wind carried no scent of life. Where once stood forests and grasslands, there was only stillness, an endless graveyard of what had been. They gathered in caves, trying to keep the fires alive. The children wept in their sleep, dreaming of giants and thunder. The elders told stories of the first dawn, of the time before the cold, to keep hope. But even the stories began to sound fragile, like embers in the dark. In one cave, a young hunter named Iro knelt before the dying fire. He held a broken spearhead in his hand, tracing its fluted edge with trembling fingers. He remembered the hunt, the mammoths, the dance of courage and death. Now there was no sound of hooves, no scent of life, only silence. He looked to the fire and whispered, "If the sky can fall, what else can end?" The flames offered no answer, only the slow crackle of surrender. The shamans gathered and spoke of a vision. A great serpent of light had struck the earth, and its breath now sleeps beneath the ice. They said the world must dream again before it could awaken. But dreams, they warned, were not always kind. Days became moons. Moons became seasons. And still, the warmth did not return. The Clovis began to drift apart. Hunger forced them to move, to search for lands where the air was not made of dust. Some traveled south, their faces hollow, their hearts heavier than their packs. Others stayed, waiting for the sun's forgiveness. But forgiveness never came. And yet, even as the cold consumed them, a strange kind of peace lingered. Around their fires, small, trembling, almost defeated, they sang softly, songs of remembrance, not of sorrow. For they knew that though the sky had burned, they still carried fire within. In one final gathering, the last of a great clan stood together beneath a black sky. Their leader, old and weathered, raised his hand toward the stars that no longer shone. "We are the children of stone," he said, his voice breaking. "The sky may fall, but the earth will remember." And so they sang, not to be saved, but to be remembered. Their voices rose into the smoke, a fragile defiance against the silence that followed. Above them, the wind carried their song across the frozen plains. It moved through the ashes, through the bones, through the forgotten places of the earth. And though they could not know it, that song would outlive them, buried deep in the soil, waiting to be found again. For even after the sky burned, the memory of the Clovis people refused to turn to dust. The world that rose from the ashes was colder, emptier, and quiet in a way that frightened even the wind. The fires had ended, but the light had not returned. The land, once alive with thunderous herds and rivers that shone like glass, was now a vast grave of silence. The snow did not melt. The air stung like sorrow. And the people of the Clovis, scattered and starved, began to understand that survival was no longer a question of skill, but of faith. They called it the Hunger Years. The mammoths were gone. The great bison had vanished into dust. The saber-tooths no longer roamed the edges of the forests. What had once been a world of abundance had become a frozen tomb. The hunters searched the empty plains and returned with nothing but stories. Stories of ghosts walking through the fog, of fires that refused to stay lit. Each dawn was met with the same ritual. A few gathered twigs, a spark, a flame that shivered more than it burned. They would warm their hands, not for comfort, but to remind themselves they were still alive. In those moments, silence became sacred. Every breath was a prayer, every heartbeat an act of defiance. Children grew thin, their laughter fading into the cold. Mothers sang softly into their ears, songs about the sun, songs they no longer remembered the warmth of. The elders, who once carried the stories of the first hunts, now spoke less. Their eyes drifted toward the horizon, as if searching for the past itself. One night, beneath a dying moon, a small group of survivors gathered inside a cave streaked with soot. The firelight trembled on the walls, illuminating drawings made long ago. Mammoths, hunters, rivers. A world that felt like a dream. A woman named Taya traced her fingers over the painted forms. "We hunted them," she whispered, her voice trembling. "And now, the earth hunts us." No one answered. They all knew she spoke the truth. The shaman said the balance had broken. The fire from the sky had stolen not only life, but memory. The earth had grown weary of men, weary of their spears, their pride, their endless hunger. And yet, the Clovis still walked. They had no choice. They followed the rivers south, where they hoped the cold might loosen its grip. The journey was slow, endless. Ice cracked beneath their feet. Their shadows stretched long across the dying light. At night, they huddled together, whispering stories of the time before the dark, as if speaking the past aloud could keep it alive a little longer. There were moments, rare and precious, when hope returned. Once, a young boy named Ren found a bird's nest, 3 small eggs, fragile and warm beneath the snow. The entire clan watched as he held them close, his eyes wide with wonder. It was the first sign of life they had seen in moons. The eggs hatched days later, and though the birds soon flew away, their wings left a promise in the air. Not everything was gone, not yet. But the hunger did not forgive. One by one, the clans began to vanish, some into the ice, others into legend. The people left no words to mark their passing, only ashes, bones, and the faint outline of fires long cold. Taya, now older, led what remained of her clan to a great valley. The snow there was thinner, and small green shoots pushed through the frost. "Here," she said softly, "the earth still remembers." They built shelters of bone and hide, gathered roots, fished the rivers, and for the first time in many seasons, laughter returned. Small, cautious, fragile. But the Clovis were not what they had been. The old ways, the mammoth hunts, the great migrations, the songs of the sky, were fading. A new world was being born, and it no longer spoke their language. One evening, as the fire burned low, Ren, now a young man, asked Taya, "What if the world does not want us anymore?" Taya looked into the flames. "Then we will teach it to remember us," she said, "not with spears or hunts, but with stories." And so they began to tell them, not of conquest, but of endurance, not of gods, but of love, love for the land, for the wind, for the fragile light that refused to die. In the darkest hours, when the cold was cruelest, they whispered to the fire, "We are still here. We are the echoes of the first dawn." Somewhere beyond the mountains, others of their kind still walked, scattered, starving, unseen. Yet the earth, silent witness to their struggle, remembered every step. For the world was not cruel, it was simply changing. And the Clovis were caught between 2 eternities, the age of giants and the age of man. Their spears rusted, their bones rested beneath frost, but their fire, small, trembling, defiant, kept burning in the dark. For as long as one flame remained, the story was not over. The wind had learned to sing differently. It no longer howled with anger, nor carried the cries of beasts long vanished. It moved softly now, like a spirit learning to whisper again. The Clovis people were fewer than ever. The clans that once crossed whole continents could now be counted by the warmth of a single fire. Yet that single flame still burned, and with it, memory itself. They called it the last fire. It flickered in a small valley surrounded by stone and silence. The air was heavy with the scent of ash, of old hunts, of ghosts. Around it, the last of the Clovis gathered, men, women, and children wrapped in furs too thin for the cold that still ruled their nights. They did not speak much anymore. Words had become fragile things, breaking too easily against the weight of hunger and time. But when they did speak, it was to remember. Elder Taya sat closest to the flame, her eyes reflecting the orange light like ancient glass. Her hair, once black as raven's wings, was now white as the snow that never left the ground. She held a broken spearhead in her hand, worn smooth by the years. Around her, the others listened as she spoke softly to the fire. "This flame," she said, "was taken from the last hunt, when the world was still loud with life, when the mammoth still walked and the rivers still sang. We carried it through the storms, through the hunger, through the silence. If it dies," she paused, the firelight trembling on her face, "then the memory dies with it." No one answered. They simply leaned closer, letting the warmth kiss their skin, as if by feeling the fire, they could feel the past again. Ren, now grown and tall, sat beside her. His eyes were sharp, but his voice carried the weight of quiet hope. "The world beyond the valley is changing," he said. "The rivers flow again. The trees, they have small leaves." Taya smiled faintly. "Then perhaps the earth has forgiven us." Ren looked into the flames. Forgiven or forgotten. The words hung in the air like ash. For though life was slowly returning to the world, it no longer belonged to them. The Clovis had become ghosts, wandering in a land that had moved on. The animals that roamed now were smaller, quicker, unfamiliar. The great herds were legends. The old tools no longer fit the new world. But still, they kept the fire. Every night they fed it. Every morning, before the dawn broke, Taya would whisper to it, as if speaking to an old friend. "Stay. Please stay." They believed the fire remembered things they could not. The warmth of the mammoth's breath, the voices of the ancestors, the feeling of a sun that once burned strong. One evening, as the cold crept closer than ever, the wind rose suddenly, fierce and cruel. The fire bent and hissed, its light shrinking. Panic rippled through the small group. Ren threw his cloak around the flames, shielding them from the storm. Sparks leapt against his skin, burning tiny scars into his hands. "Taya," he cried, "it's dying." The elder rose slowly, her knees weak, but her eyes bright with something beyond fear. "Then we will burn with it," she said, "because this flame is who we are." The storm screamed against the stones, tearing at their shelters. Snow and ash swirled together in a mad dance of white and gray. Yet through it all, they knelt around the fire, their bodies forming a wall of flesh and faith. The flame flickered, dimmed, then flared.
It rose higher than it ever had before, golden and fierce, casting shadows on the cave walls that looked like dancing spirits. The people watched, silent, trembling. In that light, they saw things. Mammoths moving through mist, hunters running beside them, laughter, birth, music, the entire memory of their world alive again. When the storm finally passed, the valley was silent once more. The fire had burned down to embers, glowing like stars fallen to earth. Taya lay beside it, her eyes closed, her breath slow. Ren touched her hand. It was warm, but fading. She smiled, a faint curl of her lips. "Do you see it?" she whispered. "The old world, in the flames?" He nodded, though tears blurred his sight. "Yes." "Then remember it," she said. "Carry it with you, even when the fire is gone." And with that, she drifted into stillness, her spirit folding into the light. Ren sat there until dawn. When the first sunbeam touched the ashes, he gathered what remained of the embers and placed them in a small clay bowl. He covered it gently, as though tucking a child into sleep. He stood at the mouth of the valley and looked out over the awakening world. Green breaking through white, rivers glittering again, the horizon soft and golden. Behind him, the cave was quiet. Before him, the future waited. He whispered to the wind, "The fire will not die." And as he walked away, the wind carried his words across the land, through forests reborn and rivers rebreathed, through time itself. Somewhere, the embers still glowed, buried in the soil, hidden beneath centuries of silence, waiting for someone, anyone, to remember.
When the fires finally died, silence returned, a silence so heavy it seemed to press against the earth itself. The winds moved through the valley, lifting the smell of charcoal and something older, something that spoke of death and memory. Beneath the gray crust of ash, the bones of the last hunt lay hidden. Mammoth ribs twisted and blackened, spears melted into curved shadows of their former shapes. For many nights, the surviving few wandered the burnt plains, searching for signs of what once was, a camp, a carving, a trace of laughter. But all they found were remnants, cracked stones that had once been hearths, and bones that whispered of the great feast that never came. The world had changed again, and this time it had left them behind. The old woman, Mira, was the first to speak of it. She said the land had turned its back because the people had forgotten their promises. "We took more than the fire gave," she murmured one night, tracing lines in the soot. "And now the fire has taken back what was never ours." The others listened, too weak to argue. The hunger had thinned them, the storms had scarred them, yet something still moved in their hearts, a quiet defiance, a will that refused to vanish. One evening, as the last light touched the black earth, a boy named Enar found something near the edge of the burned forest. A skull, smooth and pale beneath a crust of ash. Not human, too large, too ancient. A mammoth skull. And carved upon its surface, faint but unmistakable, were symbols. Circles, spirals, stars, the markings of their ancestors. He called the others. They gathered around it in silence, brushing away the soot with trembling hands. The patterns told stories of hunts and storms, of births and deaths, of times when the world was whole. It was as if the earth itself had remembered for them what they had forgotten. Mira knelt before the skull and began to hum. A low, wavering tone,
that seemed to rise from the very bones of the valley. Soon, the others joined her, their voices merging into a single sound, mournful, powerful, alive. The ash lifted in the wind, swirling like ghosts around them. And in that moment, something shifted. The flames no longer felt like punishment. The bones no longer felt like loss. Everything that had been destroyed was now a part of them, and they of it. The mammoth, the fire, the cold, the hunger, all threads in one great story. That night, they built a small fire, not to cook, not to warm, but to remember. Around it, they placed bones and stones, ashes and symbols, each one of what had been. They watched the flames rise softly into the dark, and for the first time in many moons, they felt the warmth, not just on their skin, but deep within. Mira whispered, "From ashes, we are called again." No one slept that night. They spoke of journeys, of distant lands beyond the glaciers, of skies where new stars had begun to burn. The next dawn would not find them here. The Valley of Ashes was no longer their home, but it had given them something greater, a reason to walk forward. As they prepared to leave, Enar looked back once more. The mammoth skull glowed faintly in the morning light, its carved stars catching the sun. He felt deep in his chest that this was not the end of the story. It was a memory reborn, and beneath the ashes, the bones of the old world waited still.
When the fires finally died, silence returned, a silence so heavy it seemed to press against the earth itself. The winds moved through the valley, lifting the smell of charcoal and something older, something that spoke of death and memory. Beneath the gray crust of ash, the bones of the last hunt lay hidden. Mammoth ribs twisted and blackened, spears melted into curved shadows of their former shapes. For many nights, the surviving few wandered the burnt plains, searching for signs of what once was, a camp, a carving, a trace of laughter. But all they found were remnants, cracked stones that had once been hearths, and bones that whispered of the great feast that never came. The world had changed again, and this time it had left them behind. The old woman, Mira, was the first to speak of it. She said the land had turned its back because the people had forgotten their promises. "We took more than the fire gave," she murmured one night, tracing lines in the soot. "And now the fire has taken back what was never ours." The others listened, too weak to argue. The hunger had thinned them, the storms had scarred them, yet something still moved in their hearts, a quiet defiance, a will that refused to vanish. One evening, as the last light touched the black earth, a boy named Enar found something near the edge of the burned forest, a skull, smooth and pale beneath a crust of ash. Not human, too large, too ancient, a mammoth skull. And carved upon its surface, faint but unmistakable, were symbols. Circles, spirals, stars, the markings of their ancestors. He called the others. They gathered around it in silence, brushing away the soot with trembling hands. The patterns told stories of hunts and storms, of births and deaths, of times when the world was whole. It was as if the earth itself had remembered for them what they had forgotten. Mira knelt before the skull and began to hum, a low, wavering tone that seemed to rise from the very bones of the valley. Soon, the others joined her, their voices merging into a single sound, mournful, powerful, alive. The ash lifted in the wind, swirling like ghosts around them. And in that moment, something shifted. The flames no longer felt like punishment. The bones no longer felt like loss. Everything that had been destroyed was now a part of them, and they of it. The mammoth, the fire, the cold, the hunger,
all threads in one great story. That night, they built a small fire, not to cook, not to warm, but to remember. Around it, they placed bones and stones, ashes and symbols, each one of what had been. They watched the flames rise softly into the dark, and for the first time in many moons, they felt the warmth not just on their skin, but deep within. Mira whispered, "From ashes, we are called again." No one slept that night. They spoke of journeys, of distant lands beyond the glaciers, of skies where new stars had begun to burn. The next dawn would not find them here. The Valley of Ashes was no longer their home, but it had given them something greater, a reason to walk forward. As they prepared to leave, Einar looked back once more. The mammoth skull glowed faintly in the morning light, its carved stars catching the sun. He felt deep in his chest that this was not the end of the story. It was a memory reborn, and beneath the ashes, the bones of the old world waited still.
When the dawn finally came, it was unlike any they had seen before. The first light didn't spill gently over the horizon. It erupted, washing the frozen earth in gold and rose. The snowfields shimmered like molten glass, and for a fleeting instant, it felt as if the world had been reborn. Einar stood at the edge of the chasm where the ice had spoken. The ancient figure, still entombed within the blue heart of the glacier, now glowed faintly in the sunlight. The symbols carved upon its stone pulsed with warmth, as though answering the light itself. The others gathered behind him. Mira, her face serene despite the exhaustion in her bones. The hunters, their eyes hollow yet filled with wonder. The children, quiet, as if afraid to disturb the fragile beauty before them. "This is what it wanted to show us," Mira whispered. "The end of silence." The wind shifted. It no longer howled. It sang. Through the valleys and over the ridges, the ice released its final breath, a long, soft sigh, as if the earth itself was exhaling centuries of pain. And from that sigh came warmth. Tiny drops of water began to fall, glittering in the light. The glacier was melting, not in rage, not in ruin, but in surrender. Beneath the surface, black soil stirred once more, and thin roots stretched toward the sun like hands rising from a long sleep. For days, they watched the world awaken. Streams of meltwater carved new paths through the tundra. Moss appeared on the rocks, then small shoots of grass, trembling in the cold wind. The smell of life returned. Damp earth, clean air, and the faint sweetness of something blooming unseen. Mira's strength faded with each sunrise. She spent her last days sitting by the mammoth skull they had carried this far, her fingers tracing the spirals one final time. "When we are gone," she told Einar, "these marks will remain. They are our voices, our echoes. When the next dawn comes, when others walk where we have walked, they will know we were here." Einar took her hand. It was light, fragile as ash. "And what will they remember of us?" he asked. "That we listened," she smiled, when the ice spoke back. That night, under a sky alive with aurora, Mira closed her eyes and drifted into the long sleep. The tribe gathered in silence. No tears, only the quiet knowledge that her story had returned to the earth. They placed her beside the mammoth skull, surrounded by the bones of the old world, and lit one final fire. Its glow spread across the snow, flickering like the heartbeat of a dying star, and then like the pulse of a new one. Seasons passed. The great glaciers retreated. The plains turned green again. Rivers sang where once there had been ice,
and herds of new beasts roamed the thawing land. The world began to breathe differently. Einar grew older. He taught the children to carve symbols in stone, to listen to the ground before they took from it, to light fires not in conquest, but in remembrance. The legend of the Mammoth Age became their song, not of extinction, but of renewal. And so, when the stars rose one evening, he walked alone to the hill where the fire had once burned, the air thick with the scent of spring. He looked up, saw the constellations shift, and smiled. The same lights his ancestors once painted on cave walls were still there, still guiding, still watching. But now he understood. The stories were never meant to stay still. They were meant to move, to live, to change, just as the earth does. As the wind brushed through the grass, carrying the whispers of old bones and forgotten gods, Einar spoke softly into the fading dusk. We were never lost. We were only waiting to be heard. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the stars answered, brilliant, unbroken, eternal. The age of fire was over. The age of memory had begun.